How you doing? I want to take a little bit of time to talk about two oftentimes linked concepts of deviance and violence and how they apply to the institution of sport, recreation, and physical activity. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that conceptually, be it deviance or be it violence, these things are conceptually separate. They're not synonyms, just like we kind of talked about with norms and values and things like that. But as you start getting into talking about something like deviance in crime, for example, again, we oftentimes assume, because of the word deviant and how it's been connotized here in American culture and in various places around the world, we assume that crime is a synonym. And in most parts, that's not a terrible assumption, except when you start looking at evaluating different types of behavior and what constitutes proper or appropriate behavior within the world of sport. We need to conceptually differentiate between these two things. And now, kind of starting here at the bottom, what you see is the definition for crime, and then above that the definition for deviance. And the thing is, crime is something, an act, that is somehow prohibited by law, which means that it's a norm that's been codified into the legal structure of a particular society or culture. Okay, and because it's going to be something that is prohibited by a law or sanction, therefore it's going to be enforced by a polity or a political entity, such as the police and that type of thing. Whereas if you look at understanding deviant behavior, what you start to see is that it doesn't necessarily say anything about criminal behavior. Now, what we do know is that violating the law is oftentimes seen as deviant behavior, but not all the time. Okay? And when you start looking at deviant behavior, it's just that it's behavior or even ideas or language that a large number of people see as beyond these traditional toleration limits that we have here in society. So an understanding of deviance or deviant behavior cannot exist without understanding the norms or these unwritten rules that are prevalent in our society. Also, nothing is inherently good or bad. Nothing is inherently deviant or non-deviant. It's just simply a social construction. Good example here. Punching another person in the face. You know, outside the realm of sport, outside of an MMA competition or outside a boxing ring or something like that, it's frowned upon. You don't punch people in the face. But the actual physical act of putting knuckles to skin, that's not necessarily deviant. It's only defined as deviant based upon the context. And so when we start talking about this idea that deviant behavior is based upon time, place, group, that kind of thing, this is what we're talking about, is that some things that are in sport that are perfectly normal are abnormal outside of sport, and vice versa. And that's going to be a very, very powerful concept for us as we continue on. Here, Hilliard's is talking about the uncensored war, and basically what he's talking about here in this book is that this notion that you have some things that we all believe are right and wrong, and you have things out here on the periphery that a lot of people see as deviant, but then you have a lot of stuff in between. There's a lot of stuff that isn't necessarily 100% agreed upon as being deviant or wrong by everyone. Think about something like blood doping in cycling. Okay, to me, you know, there's a lot of different types of blood doping, but one where, you know, they slowly pump the blood out of your body, pump it in a machine that cleans it, and then they either pump in new person's blood or some of your previous blood back into you, or they clean the blood that they just drew out and they pump it back into you. To me, yeah, that seems deviant. That seems extreme. That seems, whoa, beyond the toleration limits, at least for me. But it's obviously not for a lot of people, because this is a very common practice. And I'm not saying common in the sense that all the world of cycling is involved in doping or, you know, deviant, nefarious behavior like that. But there are a lot of people that do it. There are people that are kind of quasi-involved with the medical institution that have provided the technology, the means, and the access to these athletes to do it. And that's primarily what we're looking at. And one of the things that you're going to find as we go throughout this discussion is that, you know, oftentimes we think of the athlete as, you know, taking steroids or PEDs or something like that, and they're this bad person. Keep it in mind, most of those people are not basement chemists that develop these things themselves and learn how to do this themselves. There is an enabling network surrounding these individuals that does help, and that kind of lends credence to this whole idea of, you know, not everyone, there is some legitimate controversy here, because not everyone necessarily believes that this is right or wrong. And what I really love, and of course having a background in criminology and criminal justice, and then kind of amalgamating those research ideas and concepts with the world of sport, is that there's nothing that explains the extremely varied nature of deviant behavior in sports. Think about all the things when you talk about deviant behavior. PED use. If you want to talk about the Sandusky trial at Penn State. If you want to talk about, you name it, the way that coaches are treating players, the way that some coaches behave on the sideline. Imagine if I, in class, acted like some of these high-profile coaches, Bobby Knight in his prime, or if you remember Frank Martin when he was at K-State and now moved on to South Carolina. These people, they almost go crazy, but it's okay because people are like, well, it's sports, it's very emotional, and so they kind of give them a pass on that. Well, you can't do that in regular kind of polite society in other organizations, and so there's not this consensus of what is considered right and wrong. And some of the things that we do in society is different than the way we treat people in sport, and vice versa. If you think about this notion of the medicalization of deviance, well, what does that mean? It means that deviant behavior can be identified or explained by the institution of medicine. All right, so now when we're talking about trying to understand PED use, the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, we have to look towards science to say this person is guilty or this person is not guilty. When Manny Ramirez was banned for 50 and 100 games and all that kind of stuff in Major League Baseball, one of the things is he tested positive for HCG, not HGH. HCG is an estrogen-based or synthetic hormone to mimic estrogen levels, and he had elevated estrogen levels. Now, why would he have elevated estrogen levels? Well, common wisdom says it's because he's cycling down off of something. All right, and so we've blurred the lines between athletics, medicine, what is right, what is wrong. One day, if something does not appear on the banned substance list, then it's not bad. But the very next day, if it does appear on that substance list, that banned substance list, then all of a sudden it's bad. Okay, so things have just become very complicated and very confusing. So, how do we explain? You hear about athletes that get in trouble, or coaches, or if we're talking about in college athletics, the amount of graft and corruption that some people point towards within intercollegiate athletics. People are like, how is it that this keeps happening? Why is this happening? We want to explain that. We can fall back on sociological theories. We can fall back on criminological theories. We can kind of make up our own theories as we go along, and we're going to do a little bit of each of those things, because we're not necessarily going to make up our own things, but what we're going to do is we're going to do synthesis. We're going to combine bits and pieces of different theoretical concepts to explain particular acts of deviant or violent behavior. Now, just a brief little review of structural functionalism. The whole idea is that functionalism works on the consensus of norms and values. It's based upon people working together. Remember that little organic analogy where the different organs work together to keep the body alive, that type of thing. All right. Well, what happens is, because it's based on a consensus of norms and values, everyone knows what is right, everyone knows what is wrong. Participating in sports is to reaffirm that we understand those shared values. And those individuals that get in trouble, those individual athletes, Adrian Peterson recently, if you go back traditionally to Plaxico Burress or Michael Vick, or just a wide, large number of athletes or managers or people involved in sport that you can think of over the last couple of decades that have gotten in trouble, structural functionalism sees them as individuals who kind of went rogue. They knew what was wrong. They chose to act contrary to that. Therefore, they're going to kind of suffer the consequences. It was a lack of integration. They should have known. They didn't, but they are the problem. The individual is the problem. Okay, the problem with understanding structural functionalism's point of views with regards to all these things is, one, I think you can make the argument there's not a consensus of approved cultural goals, or there's not a consensus of norms and values within the world of sport. For example, what are the goals of sports? For some, it's about social mobility, getting out of a low SES neighborhood and moving up and and making a better life. Or, if USA Today did a couple of articles a few years ago following young Dominican aspiring baseball players, and how this is something they're not playing just for themselves, although they do love the game. They're playing for their entire family as a way to move them up out of the poverty-stricken environments in which they live. Also, structural functionalism says, all right, we need rules, and we need lots of them. If you have people that get in trouble, we need more rules. All right, and this is kind of, when you talk about NCAA and compliance and things like that, that's what we've done. When you see people that are starting to kind of break rules, you add more rules. The repeat violator clause, known as the death penalty with SMU in the 80s. But even something as simple as, there were rules prohibiting the number of phone calls that you could make to a potential recruit during different time periods of the year. Well, it said phone calls. Now we have texting. So you have to go back and you have to create another rule, or kind of a tangent of that rule for texting. Well, how do you regulate social media? And so what constitutes social media? If you just put in the bylaws, social media, well, then you have to define at some point what constitutes social media. But if you put in Facebook, Twitter, something like that, then that doesn't necessarily cover Tumblr and some of the other social networking sites that are starting to pop up left and right. So with functionalism, one of its limitations is that you have this dam that starts to crack, right? And so you get a little pinhole of water coming out. So you stick your finger in it. All right, well, that creates pressure on the other side of the dam, so another place pops. So you stick another finger in it. All right, and so as these problems keep arising, you're trying to pass rules and bylaws that control all these things. But each time you pass one, it's very specific to that particular grievance or form of deviance. And as a result, it doesn't apply to very many behaviors and can become antiquated or out of date fairly quickly. So it's not perfect, because one of functionalism's limitations is it doesn't deal well with social or historical change. Well, deviant behavior could signify or issue in quite a bit of wide-sweeping change in a particular society. So conflict theorists say, okay, we want to understand deviant behavior. Remember, it's all about power and money and control and exploitation, that type of thing. And it says basically those people in charge control what constitutes deviant behavior. A good example of that, Roger Goodell in the NFL gets to decide through the player or the employee code of conduct what constitutes reprehensible or abhorrent behavior. Now, if you looked at the code of conduct, it doesn't apply just to those people that commit crimes. It's anything that reflects poorly on the NFL as deemed by the commissioner's office. All right, so what conflict theory is saying is, you got too much power that's located in one person's hands or one small group's, and they are going to, and this is kind of the same argument with the lawmaking process, is that those people are going to think about their own interests and pass laws or bylaws or rules that reflect their own interests. So as a result, the people that are not in the decision-making process are inherently going to be left out. Well, some of the limitations from this point of view is, understanding that there's power, authority, oppression, and exploitation on those things is very important, but not all aspects of deviant behavior result from this exploitative process. And it also, using that kind of treadmill of production language and nomenclature, doesn't give really any power or influence to athletes, which would seem to be a bit of a misnomer, because there are some athletes in certain sports that do have a lot of power. So we move on to those interactionists and those critical theories, and these tend to be the things that this is kind of where a lot of deviant behavior research sort of picks up, especially within the world of sport, is looking at this whole understanding of norms and values. Because if you remember and harken back to that definition of deviant behavior, then what you see is it's predicated upon norms and values. So these different levels of theories, they focus on the process and then the resulting power relations from those social processes. Now, what Hughes and Coakley in the early 1990s, we're going way back here, 1991, we have these norms that are available in sport, right? Well, what constitutes normal and what constitutes abnormal behavior is going to fall into this normally accepted range. There is some deviation, and that's okay. It's saying the vast majority of people in sport are falling into this range. There are, however, people that fall outside of that range on each end, the underconformist and the overconformist. Now, underconformity is fairly easy to identify. It's that actions or things people say that reject the norms and values of a particular sport. Yep, go back here. All right, so the malice at the Palace, the brawl between the Detroit Pistons and the Indiana Pacers, when Ron Artest, jumped up into the stands and Steven Jackson followed him, and they're punching fans, and incidentally he got the wrong fan. All right, that is behavior that is ignoring the traditional norms and values that we have in the world of sport. It's one thing for players to get into a fight. Most people tend to accept that. But when players and fans get into it, you've definitely crossed the line. There's an example years ago of, I think it was the Texas Rangers bullpen before they got good, all right? And they got into it with the Oakland A's fans. And one of the relief pitchers grabbed one of those old-fashioned metal folding chairs and just chucked it into the stands and hit a lady in the face with it. Okay, this is behavior that is not accepted, even in terms of deviant behavior and people getting into trouble. Okay, overconformity is you have these norms and values that are prevalent in sport, right? Overconformity is going too far with those. All right, this whole idea that we want to win, right? So we're going to do whatever it takes to win. That uncritical acceptance of those norms and values is also going to be seen as bad. Well, keep in mind, just to kind of keep this clear in your mind, when you're talking about norms and values, the normally accepted range of action, well, you have to have norms and values that are prevalent, that people are going to conform to. In power and performance sports, there are 4 core norms and values that are termed the sport ethic. And these are the norms that people are going to conform to, overconform to, or underconform to. Okay? Very, very important. To have overconformity and underconformity, you have to conform to something. This is the something. These are the sets of norms that people oftentimes are conforming to in power and performance sports. There are the 4 core norms and values. 1, an athlete sacrifices for the love of the game. Now, what constitutes the love of the game? That's different for different people. So you can start to see there is a little bit of that social constructionist thinking here. Number 2, athletes strive for distinction. We're assuming that's through working hard, perfection, and winning and success, that kind of thing. But they strive for distinction. Dennis Rodman, back in his heyday, I know it's a bit of an old, archaic example, but he was striving for distinction. Okay, he came about it a little differently, but nonetheless he did have distinction. Athletes accept risk, which is equally distributed, and play through pain. This one is very important. You talk about it. Seth Wickersham for ESPN.com has done some stuff writing about how NFL players, how they understand pain and how they play with pain. And everyone's hurt. So to sit out means you must be super hurt. Okay, so it's all very, very relative and very different. Also, you hear about, especially in those intense, violent power and performance sports such as football or rugby, every play could be your last play. Whether you're the punter, the kicker, whether you're an offensive tackle, a running back, whatever. Everyone accepts that when they go out on the field, it could be for the very last time. And then finally, you accept no limits, quote unquote, in the pursuit of possibilities. Citius, Altius, Fortius, that's the kind of the motto of the modern Olympics, as started by de Coubertin in 1896, right? And you can kind of start to see here, accept no limits. This is where you start getting into that overconformity and PED use, right? Here, athletes accept risk and they play through pain. This is getting those individuals that, oh, I'm just dinged. I don't have a concussion, I'm just dinged. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to do my thing. All right, so now you start to see how what this does is it provides a bit more of a micro way of understanding deviant behavior, which conflict theory and structural functionalism did not give us. These are just some examples. You're all big boys and girls. You can You can read those at your leisure. I just thought it was kind of interesting that these are some of the examples of overconformity that have been identified over years and years. I mean, think about it. Growth retardant hormone. You're taking something that's going to keep you small the rest of your life. They also talk about for jockeys, like Willie Shoemaker and people like that. Jockeys that ride horses. Anorexia, bulimia, just eating disorders in general are very, very prevalent and prominent because you don't want to be more than 70 or 80 pounds. If you do, then you have to do whatever it takes to make sure you're getting below that. I remember just guys that I knew in high school that wrestled. We're not impugning wrestlers here by any means, but the things that some of these guys were taking laxatives so that they could make weight, walking around in those old sweatsuits that look like trash bags and things like that, trying to lose weight, sweat, and that kind of thing. These are oftentimes things that start to butt up against and illustrate this idea of overconformity. Okay, well, why do you do this? Why would you engage in such behavior that on the outside starts to look not only dangerous but just sort of ludicrous? When you think about Bill Romanowski, and I'm not a huge Bill Romanowski fan, but in his autobiography he talks about drinking his own urine to gain an advantage. Now, I always thought urine was sterile and I didn't think there was any minerals or nutrients in it. He apparently thought otherwise, so every morning he would collect his urine and bottoms up and enjoy a nice, cool, refreshing drink. It's not my thing, but to him it seemed perfectly normal because he was trying no limits in the pursuit of possibilities, whatever it took to keep that advantage. Why would you engage in what appears to be absolutely just despicable or gross behavior? Well, there are three reasons posited by the literature. One is that you love what you're doing and you just want to keep doing it forever. You want to be involved in sports. You see that, yes, my mind, my acumen for the game have increased, but overall my physical skills are starting to diminish. I want to maintain that advantage or edge that I have. Okay. Conformity and tension. This is kind of interesting is because oftentimes here in American culture we value team sports. Alright, so conformity is very, very important. And you also receive a modicum of attention by conforming. And I kind of think back to I think of some of the things that people will do in team sports. They'll shave their head for solidarity, right? Or they'll wear the same colors, or in hockey they grow the playoff beard, or sometimes people screwing around and pitchers in baseball will grow mustaches or whatever, right? Well, but the idea is that gets you some attention, but we extol virtues and praise on those athletes that uncritically say, I want to be part of the team. There's no I in team. It's all about the entire thing. All right? And so as a result, when we talk about Steven Jackson, for example, who followed Ron Artest into the stands, well, why did he follow? When a player jumps up and starts punching a fan, most people are like, okay, that's wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. Well, he jumped up and followed his fellow teammate into the stands, and that's going to be an outgrowth of this idea of conformity and these close-knit bonds that we have within the world of team sports. And then finally, excitement. You want to push the limits of not only what the sport can do, but also what the human body can do. And so in that part of that process, you're promoting excitement and constantly pushing that next frontier in terms of exercise science, or how you can increase your personal records and personal best, or whatever, that type of thing. Well, we're just saying. I just like the picture. It's a nice little stark dichotomy. Here's some characteristics of those people that have labeled as overconformists. They tend to have low self-esteem and the need to be accepted. And that's one of the things when we talk about Barry Bonds is that he saw all the adulation and praise that were being given to Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa during 1998 and all that kind of stuff, the whole home run chase, and they sort of brought baseball back after the 1994 work stoppage. And the thing about Barry Bonds, for example, is that he was a Hall of Fame player way before he allegedly was involved in this type of cheating or PED use or overconformist behavior. All right. one of the things is he was loved in San Francisco but nowhere else. Even going back to his days at Arizona State and college, he was always kind of a prickly fellow. Someone who didn't have that warm, fuzzy relationship with the media or his teammates, that kind of thing. Kind of sort of labeled as a malcontent. And some of the stories that you hear is that he wanted to change that. And one way to change that was to be adored by the fans and to be accepted by everyone. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, going out hitting home runs is a great way to do that. Also, what we do find is that it's kind of interesting. A lot of Division I athletes or elite amateur athletes and professional athletes actually have relatively low self-esteem. They have high sport-specific confidence, but outside of their sport, their global self-esteem of how they see themselves and view themselves tends to be fairly low, actually. Okay, and a lot of it has to do with their identity is based almost entirely on this one set of skills or occupation, whereas a healthy identity is a multifaceted one. If you remember, we were talking about that during discussions of symbolic interactionism. The idea is that our identity is a manifestation of all the different roles we play throughout the day. Well, people see me in class and they know me as a teacher. Maybe not a good one, but that's what they know me as a teacher. All right, well, there's a lot of other things that make up who I am outside of being a professor in a classroom. But when you're in the fishbowl that is modern sport, people only know you as a professional athlete or something like that, and so you kind of become a prisoner of your own success. And those people tend to have a lot of low rates of self-esteem. Also, people that engage in overconformity tend to be those individuals that there's a lot on the line. You know, I'm playing this game not just for myself or personal enjoyment, but because my entire family and extended family are dependent upon me making millions and millions of dollars. So as a result, you can start to see that people push the envelope for those reasons. The irony is that underconformity, if you think of Ricky Williams, kind of back in his heyday with Miami, when he quit because of failing the drug test, and people are like, what? So he goes and he ends up in that little tent in Australia, just kind of, you know, living the dream, I guess, and then he's going to become a yoga instructor in Northern California and all that kind of stuff. And people are like, well, he has so much talent and he just gave up on it. You know, and we don't understand that in American culture, and that's why he was labeled as an underconformist. Well, there are other aspects of underconformity, the malice, the palace that we talked about, but also just the kind of you know, general deviant or delinquent behavior that oftentimes people associate with professional athletes. All right, getting into trouble, sexual assaults with women, that type of thing. Well, overconformity and underconformity, the question becomes, are these things linked? And what we kind of find is it's hard to really measure these things. But if you think of the kind of ritualized hazing that is usually associated with overconformity, okay, hazing in and of itself is trying to get that person to give up their sense of the individual to be part of the overall team or the collective group. All right, that process is not necessarily good or bad. It's when the hazing, then how is it that lots and lots of hazing always degenerates into something physical or something really abhorrent and terrible? Well, it's because of kind of this process here that we're talking about. All right, you have a sense of hubris, and hubris is just that ancient Greek word talking about pride-driven arrogance, a sense of feelings of invulnerability, that nothing's going to stop you, and that you're not necessarily held accountable to all the rules around you. It's sort of this inflated sense of self. So if you have lots of those individuals, and you know, having grown up in Texas and seeing like the adulation that's bestowed upon these 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old boys, young men, regarding the football program, early on, if you're the star quarterback, you've got some status in that community, and you can kind of see how that, if that keeps happening year after year after year, you can start to see how that would warp the sensibilities of someone. And so then if you have a lot of people that have had that adulation and they start to see that I'm above the rules, I was passed in my English class, I didn't actually do anything, but I was the starting linebacker of the football team, and everyone knew that I needed to play in the big, you know, sub-state game. Okay, then now the rules don't apply to you like they apply to everyone else. That's how the process starts. Well, then that process of feeling like you're above the rules and stuff, that oftentimes manifests itself in other forms of underconformist behavior, binge drinking in terms of kind of the the camaraderie involved in sports, cheating, theft, sexual, physical assault, those kinds of things. There have been some famous studies, Crossit and Benedict and that kind of stuff, that looks at the prevalence of athletes involved in sexual assaults with women and things like that. And so, it's that kind of that whole thing of maybe where there's smoke, there's fire. We need to look a little bit more into these things and see how is it that these conformity-based ideas, over and under conformity, how they're linked, and more importantly for you all sport managers, if these things are going to be prevalent, how do you manage them in some sort of athletic setting? Well, how do you do that? How do you handle overconformist when the media, fans, this is what we all want. We want that individual who's going to sacrifice every ounce of their DNA, every fiber of their being to go out and do something. If you remember in 2008, Tiger Woods, when he was hurt his knee and was hobbling around the golf course in the major, and it was described as epic or heroic. We love to talk about these different things. Coaches, athletic directors are going to benefit from players that engage in overconformist behavior, because that's going to produce a better product, most likely a winning atmosphere, efficiency, that kind of thing. How do you, this is kind of a personal example. I moved to a particular town, and we were moving in, and it was August, and it was hot, and we're unloading the U-Haul and all that kind of stuff, and we hear this kind of low rumble, boop, 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 boop. And then people start coming out of their homes and they're just clapping. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what's going on here? Well, the local high school football team, which, this was, you weren't supposed to be able to practice, so it was one of those voluntary, mandatory things. And the entire football team, and at this point it just seemed like there was dozens and dozens and dozens of these kids out there, and they all shaved their head in terms of solidarity. And the school's colors were black and red. And you had like 2 banner bearers on the front that were marching with these large banners, and it was sort of very militaristic. It kind of looked like the old, Roman legions, and then there was a couple of trucks flanking all around, and they were jogging down the middle of every street, and if there was oncoming traffic, they would just pull over and people would start clapping and that kind of thing. Well, what happens when I know it's disturbing, right? What happens when people in a community rally around, enable, and support these scholastic football programs or scholastic athletic programs so much that these individuals have elevated status? You can start to see how some of this could potentially become problematic. Then you have cheating. Yeah, there's different types of cheating. There's cheating that we sort of accept, normative cheating, and this is going to be things like, oftentimes you're taught how to hook someone in basketball, to get around if you're in the lane, how to hip check if you're a smaller defender, if you're playing second or short in baseball and softball, and you're going to make a swipe tag. You're taught certain ways to do that, so the umpire, the officials think that you got the person out, and there's sort of a bit of theatrics involved. Dare I say, different type of flopping on a charge in basketball, or flopping in soccer, that type of thing. That's the kind of normative cheating. Well, the deviant cheating are going to be those things that are subject to some real punishment, not just penalties within the contest, be it PED use or, and anytime you're talking about PED use in these organized medical-based networks, you're talking about, if the FBI gets involved, and oftentimes they have because it's labeled as a distribution network, well, that's a federal crime. When the FBI was looking into, allegedly, Cam Newton down at Auburn and Mississippi State and all that kind of stuff, well, if they could have found another player and another university, well, then you have these, because what Cecil Newton was kind of found to be a part of was peddling his son for $200,000. Well, and that's different forms of basically slavery. Now, we're not talking about kind of the old antebellum South slavery, but when you talk about, there's still a lot of work being done by the FBI in terms of sex slaves, or selling off young children as kind of internet brides in other countries and coming to the United States, that type of thing. Child trafficking. Those are all different forms of the slavery laws that we have. And so if you find something like that, if you have one person who's involved in helping to move these individuals to different BCS schools for $200,000-300,000, and then when you start getting into human trafficking, that's a federal crime. So these are going to be great examples of deviant cheating. And then you think, okay, is that overconformity? Is that underconformity? Or is it some sort of weird perverted form of both? And that's kind of where we are now, is looking at trying to understand. These are fairly black and white concepts. Now when you apply them to people and the type of deviant behavior in sport, it becomes very sort of amorphous. And that's the kind of traditional view of sociology, deviance, or that kind of stuff. And when I, just using my background in criminology and criminal justice, what I like to do is just kind of, I like these criminological theories because what they do is they were developed for practitioners, much like you all in sport management, the probation officers and people like that utilize these things on a day-to-day basis. And there's a sense of being able to use them, and they're not micro level like symbolic interactionist or critical theories as much. They're not macro level like structural functionalism or conflict theory. These things are designed for the middle, to explain more than maybe small groups of 1 or 2 people, but not necessarily explain all deviant behavior in sport or within human dynamics. So, labeling theory. It's very simple. A tag is placed upon people, usually by culture or society, and this label that's placed upon individuals constrains future interactions. That's it. Okay? If one way of impugning the ultimate way to impugn masculinity for individuals in American culture is not necessarily to call them a girl, you throw like a girl or anything like that anymore, but it's to say that you are a male that is very effeminate, and so you're gay, you're a fag, you're things like that. Alright? Well, as you start to label those things, that's how people start to see you. Another example is, let's say your label is homosexual. That's what people are going to see you as, is a gay man. Regardless of how productive you are within your sport, that's going to be the overwhelming status. That's going to be the overwhelming tag that people know you as. If you're labeled as a malcontent, the Barry Bonds or Terrell Owens, if you think about that, the guy he didn't commit any crimes, but he was almost worse than other people that got in trouble with the law in terms of they talk about that locker room cancer and that kind of thing. Well, once that label's placed upon you, Randy Moss, people are hesitant to interact with you because of that label, and that's all labeling theory is talking about. That's labeling theory has been used to explain the negative, kind of the lesbian stigma and negative recruiting in women's college basketball. There was actually an article written last year on this whole idea of sexual orientation. And you had a couple of universities got in trouble, Iowa State, I believe, because what they would do is they would talk to a potential recruit, and they'll find out, that they're looking at a potential program. And then they'd say, okay, Mom and Dad, I don't know if you know this, but that potential program, it's got a lesbian coach and a lot of lesbian players on it. So if you want to send your daughter there, that's fine. That's really up to you. But here at this particular school, we stand for wholesome family values. Well, okay, you're be it libel or slander, depending on which format you're using here. You're slanderizing another program based upon assumptions that you don't necessarily have any information for. And if someone is a lesbian head coach, okay, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to place a tag on an entire basketball program, for example, that will influence mom and dad to push their daughter to go to program A instead of program B because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, so that's how labeling theory works. Pretty simple. Differential association is very interesting, I think, because it says all behavior is learned, including deviant behavior. And the people you learn the most from are those people that are close to you, those close, small peer groups. Therefore, you're going to learn deviant behavior from these individuals. And so I just have the old 1992 picture, which, by the way, look at those sweet mustaches there on Pudge and Juan Gonzalez, Raphael Palmerio. It's interesting, right? Well, here you have your guy, Jose Canseco, right? Juiced in all the trouble that Jose's had. Well, when Juiced came out, everyone was like, oh my god, that book is absolutely terrible. And then I'll be damned if the guy, a lot of what he says is garbage, but a lot of what he says as well is coming out to have some nuggets of truth. And so this 1992 Ranger team, a lot of these individuals were rumored or have been found to have been involved in PED use. And also if you think about Alex Rodriguez when he was down there, the association that people drew between Jose Canseco and A-Rod as well. The whole idea is that steroids, for example, or PEDs, it's very complicated, it's very scientific, and it's just, you don't intuitively know how to do that stuff. You have to kind of learn it from someone. And Canseco said he was very open. Talks about, okay, this is what you do. You cycle on, you cycle off. This is how you inject yourself. Here, let me show you. This is what you know, that kind of, there's sort of a teaching going on. So essentially, Jose is teaching these people on his team, and we're just kind of sort of alleging here, teaching these individuals how to engage in this deviant behavior, which is kind of one of the hallmarks of differential association. Then you have drift theory. Matza, his drift theory basically says people are pretty good overall. They just kind of drift into and out of deviant behavior. It's not that you do something bad, the whole defense of I'm a good person but I did a bad thing. I think Jeremy Giambi and Alex Rodriguez have used that over the last couple of years. You know, it's not, there's some validity to that, is that one deviant act isn't going to necessarily stain or completely explain the behavior or the totality of one person. Well, if that's the case, if you kind of drift into something that's wrong, well, how do you get out of it? How do you explain or justify to yourself that, oh, okay, I did that. I'm not really just a crappy person. I actually had some legitimate reason for it. Well, Sykes and Matza then came up with what they call these techniques of neutralization, these 5 ways of sort of neutralizing or rationalizing, justifying the deviant behavior. Denial of responsibility. You simply, nope, it's not me. I'm not involved with it. I'm going to blame something else. There's some other antecedent. Denial of injury. Well, nobody was hurt, so really, how big of a deal was this? Denial of the victim. Well, they deserved it. You know, they had this coming because, you know, they did it, or they were bad people, or whatever. Condemning the condemners is kind of interesting because it's that whole thing of like you're in trouble, so people are talking to you, and you're in trouble, so then you try to turn it back on them, and you're like, whoa, whoa, hey, you're not a perfect person. What are you talking about here? I know for a fact that you do this, this, and this, and this. You have your own skeletons in your closets. And then you have the appeal to higher loyalties, which is basically that, okay, I did this, but it was for the better of everyone. You know, it helped my team, or it helped whatever. Now, these are going to be some sport examples. Now, I'd just like you to read through these and kind of look at them, and what I was just simply trying to do was take, how is it that you do something that you know is sort of against the rules? You know, think about cheating. You're hiding it because you know it's against the rules. So already you're a good person, but you're engaging in something that's wrong. Okay? So how do you justify to yourself that you need to keep engaging in this type of behavior? And these are just taking those 5 techniques of neutralization, trying to apply them to sport. Another one is Robert K. Merton talked about anomie. And anomie is this state of normlessness, right? And basically he said in regards to any type of behavior, there's an approved way to go about getting whatever the goal is. Okay, so for example, you're in college because you want to get a master's degree, or you want to get a college degree and move up within your organization. That's your goal, is to get a job. Knock on wood, that's our goal for everyone as well. You get a job. Well, how do you go about getting that fine position in that wonderful sport organization? Well, you go to school. Okay, you get skills, you get training, you have an internship, you network. Those are the traditional means by which you go out and achieve whatever this culturally approved goal is. Okay? And so he came with this little typology to just kind of talk about this what he calls the goals ends debate involving deviant behavior. Now, the conformist is someone who believes that, you know what, I do want to get a job, and therefore I'm going to go to school so I can therefore attain that job. Getting a job is important, and it's important to go about it doing the right way. Most people are conformists, but he did identify some other types of adaptations. The innovator says, you know what, and this is kind of like cheating in sports, right? The goal is to win, and I agree with that. So I'm going to, the traditional way of going about, and the goal is to win, is to work hard, do your film study, your Peyton Manning, a la, that kind of thing. Well, the innovator's like, I want to win, but I'm going to go about it a different way. PED use. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to levy bounties and things like that if you're the New Orleans Saints. Okay? And the innovator is kind of the most important one for us because it talks about cheating. You have these others, and a guy named Berg, Daniel Berg, no, what's Berg's first name? I can't remember. Dr. Berg, that's what we'll call him. He's very famous for talking about qualitative research methods. Anyway, what he did in the late 90s, early 2000s was take these ideas, these adaptations, and applied them to deviant behavior within the Olympics. Okay, so ritualism is that you have people that are going through the process of something, but the goal of winning just isn't necessarily there. So think about a franchise. For years the Bengals were the Bungles, or the Arizona Cardinals were just anemic, and people used to say, okay, the goal is to put together a team that wins, right? Well, they didn't necessarily do that. They would put together a team, charge ticket prices and things like that, because the goal was something different. Maybe it was more about making some money, right? Maybe it was more about being profitable. The Clippers in the NBA have been sort of Sterling and his running of that franchise up until recently had been criticized. The retreatist is going to be your I don't mean to keep harping on the poor guy, but your Ricky Williams, right? He's going to kind of pull away. The goal of sport, you know what? I'm just going to get out of it. It's not necessarily about playing and winning. It's not necessarily about going and doing things differently. I just want to change the way I think about sport in general. And the funny thing about retreatism is you could make, well, maybe this is a better example for rebellion, where rebellion is basically someone who pulls away, right, just like the retreatist, but then they add their own new goals and their new means of doing it. And so you can kind of have, for both 4 and 5 here, the old idea before the X Games became this big deal of alternative sports. They're pulling away from the traditional sport infrastructure. It's not just about winning and sponsorships and that kind of thing. It was about going out and being able to do that 360 tugboat, Superman, triple lux, whatever thing that they do. And like it was that was the new way of consuming sport. All right? And so there's limited usage for all this, 3, 4, and 5 especially, but for us what we get from Merton is this critical focus on the fact that you do have these innovators, and oftentimes we use that to explain cheating within the world of sport. Okay, so what do we do with all this? Essentially, step 1, identify what form of deviant behavior. Okay? And then step 2, once you've identified that, you can use all these different theories to try to explain how is it that that person or persons engaged in said deviant behavior, and then step 3 is going out and doing something about it. Okay? And if you're probably not terribly into postmodernism or anything like that, but it's kind of this new paradigm shift in literature, art, social science, science to some extent, religion, philosophy. Just the old explanations, these grand narratives as they're called, these large explanations that explain everything, don't work. And the petite narrative, these smaller things, are sometimes killed by the grand narrative. And what becomes important for us is realizing that there's not one thing that's going to explain all athletes, all coaches, all boosters, all fans' form of deviant behavior. If you are still clinging to that archaic notion, then you're going to miss the boat, because by its very definition, deviance involves specific contexts. So you have 2 sets of fans that are getting rowdy and in trouble. It may not be the exact same solution that works for both of those. Now, you have to think about, okay, you talk about the tradition of soccer hooliganism in Western Europe. That's a little bit different. whatever problems we have in terms of crowd control strategies, tactics, security, aren't necessarily going to work for sure in Europe because it's a different game, it's a different lifestyle. The facilities in and of themselves are going to be very, very different. So just realizing that one easy, simple answer, yeah, it's not out there. And that's what we need to take. And so you're going to identify, let's say you're working in collegiate athletes, or collegiate athletics, you got a couple of athletes that are getting in trouble. What are they getting in trouble for? How often are they getting in trouble? And what are the underlying causes of them getting into trouble? Then you're going to pull a theory that's going to help you kind of answer those questions and explain it, and then you and your athletic department can put together some sort of remediation plan that's going to help in the end.